Well, I see from the chat line that Vlad needs to go teach a class in about a half hour or so. And so why don't we go ahead and get started so that he gets to hear as much of what you have to say as we can before he leaves. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Norman Graham, Director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Michigan State, and also Professor of International Relations at James Madison College of Public Affairs. Happy today to welcome the return of Christian Scott, who's a graduate of Michigan State University, I guess the College of Social Science. You didn't say which department, though.
Yeah, College of Social Science and the CSUS program in Canner.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's now a dual PhD candidate in rural sociology at Penn State and has just about completed his dissertation. He's defending in December. Perhaps this can be a warm-up for your defense strategy. I don't know.
A little bit, yeah.
He's done field research in Kyrgyzstan, and he's focused on societal issues of food security and hunger. So without further ado, let me present to you Christian Scott, who will speak for about half hour or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. So take it away, Scott.
Sure. Well, thank you all for having me. Thanks for coming today. It's, I know it's hard to be on Zoom meetings, so I appreciate you all taking the time out of your day to join me here. I want to thank you to Mary and Norm and the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies for hosting me. Yeah, so as Norm introduced me, my name is Christian Scott. I'm a PhD candidate at Penn State studying rural sociology. And what I'm going to be talking about today is beautiful southern Kyrgyzstan. So I study societal issues of food security. And so what that looks like all around the world is very, very different. However, kind of food is a unifying human experience. So it's in a lot of ways, it's a lot of fun to talk to people in Kyrgyzstan or anywhere about what they eat, because it brings up issues of family, life, finances, social life. It encompasses so many things. And so that's what my dissertation focuses on, is specifically the social, economic, and environmental determinants of household food security in southern Kyrgyzstan. So why Kyrgyzstan? Truth be told, because it's beautiful and the people are really nice, is why I've really focused on that place, at least in the foreseeable future here for my professional endeavors. But scientifically, Kyrgyzstan is a place that's undergoing a lot of transformations. So it's a high elevation country. And so naturally, with most of it being mountains, it's heavily impacted by climate change. It's a former Soviet Union country, so it's been undergoing political, economic, and social transformations since the early 90s. And it's a developing country. So as you would imagine, the economic conditions there are improving, and they're changing every year as the world becomes increasingly globalized in our economic interactions. And so it's a place where you kind of have these old historical trends. So it was a route along the old Silk Road, where traditionally people practiced nomadism or seasonal transhumance. And so you have this historical kind of agro-pastoral heritage merged with the contemporary Kyrgyzstan, which is very heavily involved in labor migration, with people leaving the country and going to other places in search of employment to be able to send money back. And it's increasingly entering into an urbanized context with people leaving the rural areas and going to urban places. And so you kind of have this mesh of the old and the new in Kyrgyzstan, that plays out in very unique ways involving food and food security. Kyrgyzstan, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, had substantial economic difficulties moving forward. And so through that process, there was a concentration of poverty, especially kind of poverty that's not out in front of everything in the rural areas. So Kyrgyzstan has a majority of its population is, I think 70% of the population is located in rural areas where there is a concentration of food insecurity. Why is there food insecurity in rural Kyrgyzstan? Partly because they're very vulnerable to shocks living in a mountain environment. There's also a lack of economic opportunities in these rural places, and there's very little arable land. So there's not a long growing season to be able to grow traditional high yielding crops, specifically cereal crops, that you might find in other ecological situations. So 2/3 of the food insecure households in Kyrgyzstan are in rural areas, and 18% of children, according to UNICEF, are malnourished. A lot of the issues of this malnourishment stem from early childhood development and prenatal care, where there's high rates of anemia and stunting and wasting resulting from a lack of nutritious foods available. And you'll see here as a family outside of their yurt. And so this kind of highlights some of the conditions that are found all over Kyrgyzstan. And what you'll see throughout Kyrgyzstan are these yurts, people moving in seasonal pastures with the movement of livestock up and down the mountain pastures as they graze. And so those seasonal movements of livestock form the basis of rural livelihoods for the most part. And they also form the basis of diets. So we'll see later too, that it's heavily, Kyrgyz diets are heavily reliant on dairy and meat products, which they get from the livestock that they herd. So the main research question here is looking at what are the social, environmental, and economic aspects of rural life that collectively contribute to household food security. So specifically, this study operationalizes that by looking at labor migration, remittances, agropastoralism, and different kinds of social networks. So the study thinks of, or rather I think of food security in these 4 pillars of food security. So you have availability of food security. Is there physically food in the area? Access. Is there the ability of households to be able to purchase, to be able to reach the food that is necessary and reach food that is safe, affordable, and culturally relevant? Utilization. So is the food being utilized in a way that is conducive to nourishment? If you burn all your food, then you're clearly not food secure. And if you're able to prepare foods in a nutritious and safe way, obviously, or preserve foods in a nutritious and safe way, obviously your food security is enhanced. And then finally, sustainability is looking at these trends more long-term. So are you, not just do you have enough to eat today or this week, but are households able to secure enough food and enough healthy food over a longer period of time? How the study does that is it looks at these classifications, social, economic, and environmental, and it kind of looks at coping and adaptation, kind of endowments, things that are helping food security, as well as kind of these shocks and challenges, things that abate food security. So things that hurt food security and things that help it. And not just from a deficit perspective, but also from how does a household cope with times that there isn't enough food to eat? Or how does a household make sure that those times don't actually end up occurring? So we look down at the different breakdowns of food security in terms of availability, access, resilience / sustainability, and utilization. But there's also other ways to think of food security. You can think of kind of acute or chronic, where acute is there's a short-term lack of food there's not enough to eat. And where you have chronic food insecurity is where you wouldn't have enough over a longer period of time. And this comes out in things like stunting and wasting, where stunting, you have a low weight for age, or stunting, specifically for children, you have a low height to age. And these are kind of indicators of short-term and long-term food insecurity, which the study seeks to kind of put this temporal scope on the main problem, which is food insecurity. So the study uses a number of different theoretical frameworks in which to look at the determinants. So political ecology is pursued for environmental knowledge and environmental subject making and environmental identity. It's under the concept of where the environment seeks to be an entity in and of itself and is inherently political and part of the human processes that are found in southern Kyrgyzstan. The social determinants are looked at under the concepts of social capital, where you have an exchange of social relations that yields benefits to the sender or receiver. And social networks is a way of quantifying this and mapping them. And then you also have the specific economic aspect, where you look at labor migration and aspects of the informal economy. I should mention that labor migration is a major focus because 1/3 of the Kyrgyz gross domestic product is made up of remittances, remittances being the money that migrants send back home to their origin communities from their labor destination. So with all this kind of cash infusion coming from the outside, it touches almost every aspect of Kyrgyz society, and especially household food security in southern Kyrgyzstan. Where is Kyrgyzstan? Kyrgyzstan is in the center of Central Asia, has the Pamir and the Tian Shan mountain ranges. It borders China, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. And this study focuses in on southern Kyrgyzstan. So it takes a kind of a wide perspective of kind of Osh Oblast here. Oblast is like a state or a province. And then it further targets its analysis to look at the rayon of Alai. And Alai rayon, you can see here, consists of two major valleys, the Alai Valley and the Gulcha River Valley. Here is the Alai Valley, photo credit to my wife for taking this up on the higher side near the border with Tajikistan. And this is looking out over Alai Valley, and you can get an idea for kind of the topography and why it's not suited necessarily for agriculture, but well suited for livestock grazing. So the Southern Highlands are operationalized in the analysis of this study by looking at Alai Rayon specifically. Alai Rayon is like a county, so it's like a county. And so you can see here is it starts with the municipal seat of Gulcha and extends down towards the border in Tajikistan and China. The initial effort of the study, the initial data collection of the study was conducted in 2017. For this study, it's part of a larger study, but for this study, was in 2017, where a representative sample was collected for 1,234 surveys. And in those surveys, we were able to draw a sample strata looking at selecting villages to be convenient sampled within the village, looking at market access, political representation, elevation, and population. So with that, we were able to select 17 small villages. Actually, it breaks down to 23 if you look at we'll talk about hamlets and villages a little later. So we focused on 23. These are geopins of actually where the surveys were conducted. So total in the surveys, there's 1,234 household surveys conducted with an individual household representative. So within that sample, there was questions obtained about 6,581 individuals, over 2,000 children. And we also asked questions about migrants that were away so that we could learn about the impact of remittances and labor migration on food security. There were also in-depth interviews conducted alongside of these, although that information will not be presented here in this talk. So the main findings of that larger survey were that households experience shocks and have a higher consumptive measure of food insecurity, consumptive being where the study would measure how much food they've had over the past week and how much food, rather, not just how much, exactly what types of food a household has had over the past week and exactly what types of food a household has consumed over the past 24 hours. So following a socioeconomic or an environmental shock, a household was found to have a higher consumptive measure of food security, which is surprising. And at the same time, it was found to have higher experiential measures of food insecurity and higher expenditures overall of the household following a shock. So households are exhibiting behaviors demonstrating food insecurity or having presented coping strategies like sending a migrant away or taking out a loan for food in the aftermath of a shock, and yet their diets were improving. This seemed to suggest that those coping strategies that households were taking are effective in their aims, and they are able to effectively address a lot of the challenges that come up in the immediate aftermath of a socioeconomic or an environmental shock. Now, to look at this in terms of a longer scale, I really focused down in a 2019 data collection effort on one specific village. That specific village is Kichiblululu here in the kind of the northeast quadrant of Alai. And so in 2019, I was able to go to Kichiblulu and conduct surveys and interviews over the course of 9 months. So I went starting in spring or in winter and ending then in the fall. I was able to go and conduct a survey once at the low point of food insecurity. Once at the low point of food security in the winter, and once at the high point of food security in the summer, so that I could get a good compare and contrast from the two different time points. But what I was also able to do then is to make more trips in between and conduct more interviews for qualitative analysis to kind of understand more of the nuances. And that's really where the most of this talk is going to be focused here on today. If we can advance, there we go. Here it is, beautiful Kichiblulu. Kichiblulu is actually, it's a municipality, so it's a string of 7 villages or 4 little hamlets. Here's the furthest west one where I stayed when I did data collection. So there's this string of 6 villages that are also named for one village. And so I was able to conduct 157 surveys in the winter. And that's in the bottom left is our survey enumerator team with myself, and 157 surveys in the summer, as well as conduct 44 detailed interviews and make detailed notation. The surveys asked very specific, externally validated measures of household food security. So they asked around experiential measures of food insecurity. So if a household, they asked if in the past 30 days, if a household has had to skip a meal, if you've had to feed your child but not yourself, if you have had to sell something to be able to afford food. That's where the coping strategy index and the household food insecurity access scale come into question. The household hunger scale asks some more extreme questions. If somebody hasn't eaten in a week, or if they've had to sell things, a significant portion of their assets, it's able to ask those questions. And then it also asks about the 24-hour and the 7-day dietary recall questions to figure out exactly what households are eating and what the nutritional makeup is of the household, of what they're eating. There's also 2 more validated measures that were included, which is one is the self-assessed food security status. So we kind of ask people to rate themselves as food secure, food insecure, moderately food insecure, extremely food insecure. And then we were also able to get an idea of exactly how much of a total household expenditure are households estimating that they are spending on food. And if it's you'll see it's a different type of measurement where you can see if somebody is maybe producing more of their own food, they'll have a lower number, or if they're very reliant on buying certain types of food, they might have a higher number. And so it's a heavier economic burden on their household to be able to provide for food for everyone. The social networks in the study were measured by looking at kinship, agro-pastoral labor, and food sharing networks. Specifically, agro-pastoral labor focuses on, this is the village again, where agro-pastoralism is kind of what the modern day, much of the modern day rural life has settled into in the wake of this transitioning system, where there is sedentary agriculture practiced in situ in the village at the household, while other family members, or they send livestock away with shepherds during the warmer months to be traveling up in the mountains and grazing, and then they come back to the village in the winter. So it's kind of this modern day blend between agriculture in one spot and the historical heritage of nomadism and moving in pasture. And then the study also asked about food sharing. So exactly, are you giving food to someone who needs it, or are you receiving food from someone within the village in order to cope with difficult times? Survey also asked very specific questions about the age, education level, and financial circumstances around every adult in the household. And I also asked about the age and educational circumstances around every child in a household. It asked questions about household finances, labor migration, how are remittances spent, how many remittances are received, what are the impacts of climate change, and what kind of environmental shocks are there? And then what are the agro-pastoral practices that a specific household is engaging in? The more qualitative analysis was focused more on an intra-household level. So it's asking questions about exactly how food is utilized, how households make it through tough times, and how shocks, or rather celebrations, the opposite, good things, how they impact a household. Like what we could see here is kind of this is a women's business association collective that's selling in Ely Valley. And so the qualitative aspect was really able to get at some of the more, the other aspects of rural life that are not easily recorded in a survey. We were able to ask people, what was the hardest part about living here, and what's the best part about living here? And then ask about specifics regarding their household food security management, like who eats when and things like that. Kinship networks were found to be more dense than labor and food sharing networks. So one of the issues that I came across in conducting the survey for a whole network of the village is that invariably there were people that came up that were named when asked to name an individual in which you are a direct blood relative to within the village, that did not show up in the household rosters, or were not overly abundant across the seasons. And so what I did there is I kind of treated those as a different kind of node in the network analysis that I made up a term. I called it a singulate. And so what you see here is a map of each household and their connections between each other as mapped by kinship, with a normal survey respondent household as an unfilled in node, and a singulate, a household that we don't have a full survey for, but we know that somebody has indicated that they're related to them, filled in as a black node here. And so what I was able to observe is that there are clusters of kinship groups in the winter and in the summer. Now, why would this change from the winter to the summer? That's because people are moving. It's a different group of people in the village in the winter as opposed to in the summer. There's also a possibility of survey error. And there's also possibilities of marriages and families and children moving out and starting their own households. And so it's interesting to see this change from the winter to the summer. And then to go into that and start drawing some conclusions about how that relates with household food security, we can do with some statistical modeling. Before I get into that, I want to real quick show the food sharing and the labor networks. So these were not as well suited for modeling because they were not as dense. These are more sparse. Certainly the labor and the food sharing. So what you see here is these are directed ties. So a kinship tie is not directed. It just is or isn't. But here you'll have a household that is actively sharing food to another household. And I guess specifically here you can see what's a good example of this would be a focal node in the winter food sharing network. You'll see on the right side there's one household that seems to be receiving food from a lot of different households. And that's a food insecurity coping strategy. That's something that we absolutely will talk about later in the qualitative analysis. And that network was also quite sparse in the summer without maybe that single focal node and without as many connections. Labor sharing was found to be very sparse. And I think this is an interesting distinction because there are aspects of agro-pastoral life and labor specifically that households do share all the time. But in the survey, we're asking a very specific form of labor sharing between individuals in a household, across households, a more formalized manner. And that was not bore out in the labor and in the winter and summer labor sharing network sociograms. So you can see there's not a lot of formal labor sharing. We'll get back to that a little later. Now, how does this relate to household food security? So we can get a good picture of kind of how different households are eating by manipulating, if you will, the size of the nodes dependent on the, what I did here is I standardized the value of the household dietary diversity score. And I set the singulates, the ones that we don't have full data to, I set that to the mean, or sorry, the median. So what you have here is the size of a node corresponds to the standardized value of household dietary diversity. And you can see some interesting trends with groups of households that have more food insecurity in their kinship groups, or groups that have less food insecurity in their kinship groups. I think perhaps the most telling one of these sociograms, and we did it for all of the different measures, is the standardized value for reduced consumption score index. And consumption score index, sorry, coping strategy index. Coping strategy index talks about those in the past 30 days, have you skipped meals? And so when that value is standardized and mapped onto different sociograms, you're able to see then some focal nodes that are more well connected to the wider kinship networks and also exhibiting more coping strategies. So this is interesting. This is something to ask about. And I think then what we're presenting here is, I'm not necessarily presenting the models associated with this. If I were to, it would demonstrate that for experiential food insecurity, like coping strategies, households that are not alone, they are not a singulate, they are not an isolate in the network, they have at least one tie, those households are more likely to exhibit coping strategies than households that are not, if that makes sense. So looking at this, kind of focusing in now on the qualitative analysis, when I kind of did this kind of sequentially. I took the wider surveys and then I narrowed it down in the qualitative analysis. to look at a couple of key important themes. And so in thematic analysis, 3 important themes emerged. First one being environmental subjects, second one being the village economy, and the third one being intra-household labor allocation. And so I talked a little bit about the political ecology framework before, but I think what is the number one theme within, the number one identified theme in qualitative analysis was the idea of environmental subjects or environmental subject making, the idea that the very identity of the people in the village of Kichiblulu is tied to the environment in which they are situated in. And I think an interesting story about maybe how I started in 2017 asking about the relationship with the environment was I would ask about, well, you know, do you identify with the mountains? Do you feel like mountains are part of your identity? And people really didn't necessarily understand the question. What I've come to appreciate since then in my analysis is that, and by talking to people and asking them, is that it's less about the mountains and it's more about the space in between where all the life happens, the river, the pasture, the village. And so one good quote that talks about this is the pasture is the time of plenty. And so in the pasture time, when people go out to Jailo in the summers, that's the summer grazing pastures is a Jailo. People eat a different kind of food that they would eat at other times. So it's butter, cheeses, pasta, jams. People make salads depending on the time of year. And so the relationship that people have with the environment is not only central to their identity, but it also informs their food security status and goes a long way to explaining the different aspects of assets, access, availability, utilization, and sustainability. So you see things like the river, right? So the river, yes, it provides water to the community, but it also provides what it represents is the route out to the pasture and the ability of a household to provide water for their livestock and to irrigate their fields. It also has kind of a dark side. It has a lot of natural disasters stem from the river. This is the Lulu River, where you have landslides and floods that take out households, that ruin fields, that take livestock, and yes, that kill people. So at the same time, you have a reverence and appreciation for nature and the river. You also have kind of, I wouldn't say a healthy appreciation, maybe not a fear, of the natural conditions in which people find themselves living. And I think this is a good quote that talks about that. So in the winter, there is not much dairy products in our house. The cows mostly calve in the spring. We make butter and we store it for the winter. Some cows produce little milk during the winter. So in the milk, we consume some milk and make ayran, which is a dried yogurt, from it. People like dairy products here in the village. Dairy products are our main diet. People call it aktul, which means white food. The times when cows produce less milk, we say we are having a tough time without white food. Today, our cows are out in pasture, so we are having tough times. To cope with the shortage of milk while we go to pasture, to bring some milk, ayran, and kumiz. Kumiz is fermented mare's milk, which is packed full of nutrients, specifically protein, and is preservable for longer periods of time. And so you have these kind of moral heritage foods that inform the both nutrition that people are consuming according to the time of the year, but they also talk to that relationship with going out to the pasture, with eating kumiz during spring and summer. And kumiz is not then available when the mares are not having babies. In the fall and the winter, there's not as much that's available, and people need to rely more then on preserved foods. which leads to another interesting point. Preserved foods are important because of the dramatic shifts in the seasons. So people are not necessarily able to have vegetables year round. So what they turn to is traditional indigenous knowledge and knowledge that's passed down through generations, as well as new, I mean, people are looking it up on their phones, on the internet, and with development initiatives and government training programs. How can we preserve food through the winter to help make more lean times not as tough? So, I mean, these are good two quotes that talk specifically about the composition of diets. So we mainly eat borsak, which is a fried dough, ormo, which is a rolled dough with steamed potatoes. We fry potatoes and meat, you know, Kyrgyz foods. These are our main foods. And potatoes are important because they are well suited to being cultivated at high elevation. So you have what we here see referred to as Kyrgyz foods are foods that are both easy to preserve in traditional ways or because there's not a lot of refrigeration making it back from the pasture. It needs to be transported oftentimes on horseback or from a mule or a donkey. And it also demonstrates the ecological suitability that you find with meat, dairy, and potatoes being grown at this elevation. So in the spring, our preservations finish. Frankly, we struggle until our potatoes and carrots yield a harvest. They get expensive to buy at market. Meat becomes expensive to buy at market. As for potatoes, we plant as much as we can and preserve it. After September, there aren't many difficulties until February, and then we have difficulties. So there are difficult times, and how people cope with those difficult times is a testament to their resilience and also a testament to the amount that people have become actively engaged in environmental subject making. So you have here is rose hip, something that's found wild and foraged, and people bring it and they make traditional medicine from the jam, and they're able to get enhanced nutrition from wild caught foods that they normally would not have been able to get through markets, because I'm sure, as you would imagine, market access in a very rural location is limited. And market access is also seasonal. So there can be landslides and there can be floods that wash out the road and limit market access of the whole village, depending on the season. And that's why, again, these preservation and the act of environmental subject making is so very important. So we are Kyrgyz. Of course we eat meat. So households have these, this is what we see as kurut. On the right here is the yogurt balls drying out front of the, this is the Budalik Jailo in Kitub-Lulu. This is one of the pastures. And on the left here, we have Iran, which is rehydrated, as well as some jams from some wild foraged jams along the mountainside in Kitub-Lulu. So households rely on foraging. They rely on what they're bringing back from pastures or what they're able to get from the pasture. And they also have a really interesting, specific in Kitub-Lulu, there's obviously, so there's community pasture management. The way that households or the village organizes who accesses the pastures is closely tied to intergenerational knowledge and the heritage of your family. So we've mapped out those kinship ties. But what's interesting is those kinship relations also map to pasture access. You go to the pasture that your forefathers went to. People know their generations patrilineally back 9 generations. So it's very important to have this continuation of knowledge, this continuation of environmental subject making. Also, following the collapse in Kitub-Lulu, there was a good deal of difficulty when in Kitub-Lulu it was goats, is what they specialized in. And when the collectivized system of ownership collapsed, the central stables were not able to be maintained. And so a lot of those goats died. And in that period, 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, some severe food insecurity, acute malnourishment, until households were able to replenish their basically their assets and establish private ownership of cattle, of horse, and of a specific breed of Kyrgyz flat-tailed sheep that endowed them with the capability of being able to make a livelihood out in this beautiful mountain setting. There was also a collectivized ownership of yaks that was in Kichiblulu. And yaks are an interesting animal. They're kind of semi-domesticated, and they do very, very well at high elevation. They need very little inputs. They don't need to come back to the village. They pretty much just need salt and a shepherd to kind of know where they are. And so Kichiblulu, following the collapse and the reorganization, they kept that community yak herd together, and they kept it in a form of communal ownership, so that each household, or each family, I should say, this is mostly tied to families, maintained partial ownership of a yak. And so it started out as a smaller herd, and now it's up over 100 yaks. Kichiblulu has a community representative who is the shepherd and goes out and watches over these yaks and is able to bring back yak milk, which is very nutritious and very valuable. Yak meat, very nutritious, very valuable. Yak fur, or hide, and the pelt are very valuable. And so they're able to have this kind of sustainable resource that they're sharing, and they're able to give. Maybe they sell a yak and they slaughter a yak or two following a landslide that took out a house of a very vulnerable household. Well, they'll sell a couple of the community yaks and they'll be able to help out that household. So there's these foods from the yaks, foods from the flat-tailed sheep, foods from horses like this ayran and like kumis and other dairy products that are tying together different generations with the act of environmental subject making, where people are so intimately connected with the pasture and with family that it's impossible to separate the two sometimes, like the community yak herd. And this manifests itself in interesting ways. So the second thing that I posit is that there is this idea of the village economy. And the village economy is this idea where there's kind of an insular village economy where people are sharing, they're providing this community assistance like you see with the yaks. There's really there's one road coming in and out, so you don't have a lot of market access necessarily. And at the same time, you have this injection of remittances, of financial capital that is being spent in the village on different things, very specific things, depending on economic and social pressures and motivations. So you have this insular aspect with the external cash coming in from people that are completely out with the country, that make a really unique setting. So a good example of community assistance is something where there is a saying as goes, some neighbors are closer to you than even your close relatives. So here we think back to the kinship networks, and it's very interesting to see that people provide assistance freely to other households, not just based on these kinship networks, but simply prefaced on their proximity within the village. People rely on one another. We might not have much comfort and infrastructure like other places, but if you look from the side of human values, I think you can see more humanity than in other places. They're interested in helping others, and they are kind. And the people of Kichiblulu really believe this. It is something that is tied, yes, to the nomadic heritage, but beyond that, it's also endowed a community resilience within the village economy that would not be possible without this kind of altruistic form of community assistance. When somebody is in need, they're helped, especially around food insecurity. This is why we don't see as many issues of acute food insecurity. Now, there's a distinction to be made here between community assistance and sharing. So in sharing, this is where we harken back to the nomadic lifestyle, the Silk Road, and people sharing food and labor and support, not just because someone needs it, but because someone is a guest, because they are from another household, as they are from another area. And I'm sure Jeff has experienced very similar things than me. You are invited into the yurt and you are given food and good conversation. And it is not out of community assistance. They're not doing it necessarily because you need help. It is given between individuals, between households, across family ties, simply on the basis of sharing, and hospitality is a central part of social interaction in the village economy. So you have big events, weddings and celebration, they're a big deal. And there's a lot of social pressure then to bring lavish gifts, to bring gifts that are very personal and mean a lot. So there is some elements of social stratification even within the practice of sharing, where you have these celebrations where, and this is again where remittances come in, where households feel pressure to provide a very big and extravagant gift. They often spend remittance money on it as a way of demonstrating this hospitality, of demonstrating sharing and the art of, and the ability to give without any expectation of reciprocation. And so that's an important distinction between assistance and sharing there. The other thing that is really interesting is the insular economic sector, where you have the recent years, the last 3 years, people have started practicing bartering. They bring flour and onion by car and exchange them for berries like blackcurrant. It is a laborious job to collect berries. They ripen in the September sun. In September, when the berries ripen and are collected, we exchange them for flour, 1 pail of berries for 1 sack of flour. And so this is really important in Kichi-Blulu because there is that one road in and out, and there is limited access to fruit and vegetables. And so households are able to get a more diverse diet and able to better access the village economy by bartering, by trading, by having more informal exchanges, whether it be for labor or for goods. And it forms really the backbone of food access in the village through this insular economic sector of the village economy. Here we have a perfect example of a kind of a varied spring diet at my friend Ibrahim's house. Yeah, so what is it about food security? Let me kind of just tie this all together. What are the determinants of economic, social, and environmental? What are the aspects of rural life that inform food security? Well, certainly labor migration has a big role to play. And the money that comes back from labor migration in the form of remittances has an important role to play, specifically in purchasing for households purchasing items that they would not be able to consume during that season. Things like fruits and vegetables that simply cannot be grown, and there needs to be an economic avenue in which for them to access that food for proper nutrition, especially for children. And this is when we talk about the first 1,000 days for prenatal care. Households manage food insecurity largely through kinship networks, but also through community assistance and generosity, and coping with difficult times and endowing their household to a livelihood strategy that is conducive to household food security is heavily, heavily, heavily emphasized on aspects of intergenerational transfer of knowledge and education around obtaining a kind of a sustainable lifestyle or a sustainable source of food throughout the seasons. And whether that be through preservation, through wild foraging, through getting skills and being able to develop relationships in the village so that you can form a household strategy, like a contractor is able to make money by performing contracting jobs based on, in large part, prefaced on his kinship, network access, and the people that his family knows hiring him to be able to complete those tasks. And then finally, the environmental aspect is huge. So it's the seasonal relationship between the environment, between social aspects like celebrations, or even the physical proximity of where people are, changes throughout the seasons. And it's not just experienced with snow on the ground and livestock up and down in the mountains. It's also experienced when the road washes out. And then the insular nature of the village economy is the only economic avenue. It's also experienced when households are sharing kumis in Jailo as they establish connections with one another and freely share this kind of moral heritage food, this one of the white foods. And so this study has implications reaching beyond just the small scale. It's not just about Kichiblulu. And what I'm doing now actually is gearing up to kind of continue the project. I'm very much on the job market. So this study has important policy ramifications for climate change resilience, for traditional knowledge preservation, and for rural development initiatives. It's a blend of quantitative and qualitative methods that allow for a close examination of food security determinants. And it also focuses on an area that is under-researched, especially in contemporary social science, where we don't have necessarily a lot of information about how households are able to achieve food security or able to abate food insecurity in what is very much a dynamic state of a transforming Kyrgyzstan, of a new area of theoretical and applied scientific significance. So I would like to thank partners, including Jeff at Penn State, at South Dakota State, at the University of Central Asia, the International University of Kyrgyzstan, as well as the research team, who without their help, this simply would not have been possible. And of course, my lovely wife, who supported me all through this whole process and moved to Kyrgyzstan with me. And so that's her there on the left. And on the right, we have the 2017 data collection team, my advisor, Dr. Chi, who all made this work possible. So any questions, comments? I am still moving the project forward. And so I would certainly love to hear from anyone and what you think. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
Very nice presentation, Christian.
Thanks.
You used a phrase that I don't understand. Moral heritage foods. Could you expand on that a bit?
Sure. So, moral heritage food, it's more framed in the study as kind of the whites. These are foods that are indicative of heritage. They're passed down from family to family, knowledge to knowledge, and they reflect the environmental conditions in which they're sent. But they also have this, yes, they're nutritious, but they obtain a moral quality where they are good in and of themselves. I've heard some people say that the whites should not be sold in Kyrgyzstan, that they are meant to be freely shared and given and it is therefore immoral to sell them. So these foods that come from the gilo, they come from the pasture. They kind of take on this transcendent role in households where they are more than just nourishment. They're a reflection of that tie to family and that appreciation of the environment. Does that make sense?
Surely gives me your understanding of that. Yeah, we certainly experienced both in 2016, 2017 with the therapeutic aspects of kumis, and I think that is underappreciated. Not that I think there's going to be a big market for kumis in the U.S. in any time.
I haven't seen it at Dusty's at all.
No.
I think we have a hard enough time with horse meat, let alone horse milk. So.
Right. So, other questions? You want to raise your hand, or just if there's a void, jump in there. Relatively compact group here now, so feel free to engage, Christian. I wonder if you could talk a little more about the climate change impact, because you cite that as one of the key elements at the end there, and you mentioned earlier and so forth. But you have some preliminary thoughts on how that's having an impact and
absolutely
where it's going?
So it has really profound impacts. One of the obvious ways that you can see just by looking is there's glacial retreat. So there's less water available in the river, or it's more veritable. So you have more flash floods, you have more mudslides, and you have a concentration of water. This water security is a big issue that I didn't really talk about as much in the talk, but especially in the village, the waterborne diseases, both impact on people and in livestock health, is a very, very big threat to food security in Kichiblulu. And so that water variability due to climate change it's making it hard. It's making life out there much harder. And so how households and how people are able to cope with climate change going forward is going to be central in establishing food security or rural development in the region as a whole. So yeah, it's felt very profound.
So if I might add on to that, then does this have a dramatic impact on migration? So you talk about migration, labor migration for seeking employment and the impact of remittances, which has obviously been very important in the region for quite a long time. Where are people going now, and are many actually moving?
So in terms of local migration, people have to go farther into pastures as climate change changes the conditions, and the seasonal rotation of pastures also changes. Jeff would probably know a little bit more about the specifics of the pastures through climate change. But in terms of labor migration, I think what it is most profound, at least in Kichiblulu, is the variability. So a lot of times migration is undertaken as a specific household calculus of risk. And so when you see the effects of climate change increasing the risk of agropastoralism, or just exclusively agropastoralism in the village, it's more of a necessity to balance your livelihood strategies with migration and agropastoralism. So it's adding momentum. And you also have households kind of combining the two that leave in the winter because it's too intense, it's too veritable, it's too unpredictable, there's avalanches. And so, yeah, they go to Osh or Bishkek, the major cities nearby. And so, yeah, it's changing both domestic migration within the country and where people work. And it's also changing, international labor migration and how households balance risk? It's a good question. That's part of what kind of the next step is then to this work, is really focusing on that. What are the impacts of climate change, and how are environmental subjects and the village economy impacted by climate change? Ooh, I have a question here from Sarah. Have you noticed COVID-19 or the current political climate in Kyrgyzstan having any significant impact on these rural communities, such as remittances or food access? Absolutely. So initially in COVID-19, it wasn't a rock slide or a landslide, but it may as well have been. So Kichiblulu during the lockdown they moved concrete blocks and they quarantined the village very physically. I mean, it was locked down. You could not get out, you could not get in. That was it. So obviously that had big impacts on food access. Now I wasn't there, but from the people that I talked to, is they had limited access. This isn't data, so I don't necessarily want to present it as complete fact. It's more anecdotal. There have been substantial challenges with remittances and labor migration. As lockdowns occurred, people couldn't get back and forth, and there was a change in labor migration. A lot of people from Kyrgyzstan go to Russia, and there was a fear that, I mean, just like all around the world, that international travel would be restricted. So a lot of households immediately sent migrants, or they had migrants overstay visas, or they had migrants maybe be put into more risky situations, or had to stay in a certain job in a destination with the explicit acknowledgement that they couldn't get back and that it would be a risk if they did. So it changed a lot of things. And again, there's not necessarily, I don't have data, but there's been news articles about how households are reticent to send a parent back home to be with their kids, because they have to be away and working in Russia or in a destination to be able to supply for the economic need of their family. Yeah, it's been tough. COVID, certainly.
Yeah, and I think that this manifests in a variety of ways. One of the main activities that Kyrgyz migrants do in Russia is in the building trades, though that's not the only thing they do. And when your economy is shut down, things are on hold, you're not building a whole lot. So, we're expecting to see a very significant drop in remittances this year. Last year was, there was quite a high level of remittances. But, Kyrgyzstan is susceptible to all sorts of shocks. There was a drop in remittances, significant drop in remittances in the 2009 recession. There was an even larger drop after the imposition of sanctions following Russia's invasion of Crimea. And this one will be as large as or greater than that last one. So it's quite complicated. But something that a lot of households have really come to depend upon that remittance is permanent income as opposed to extra money.
And then you have the aspect of the outgoing political regime is very close with Russia. So now you have the uncertainty of Russian relations I have no idea what the result of the December elections will be, but that relationship with Russia is very important for remittances and for the financial well-being of the country. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, there could be some interesting knock-on effects because there's actually a significant amount of remittances that flow from Kyrgyzstan into Tajikistan.
There used to be a fair amount of migration for labor to Kazakhstan as well. I think especially in the building of the new capital and so forth. I suspect that's probably been curtailed quite a bit, especially given the change in economic fortunes in Kazakhstan as well.
Yeah, it's,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we were just looking at this recently, and Kazakhstan, the flow of remittances from Kazakhstan to Kyrgyzstan is not as large as it once was. There's still a very strong flow from Kazakhstan to Tajikistan, but Kazakhstan, is more. There's a certain amount of remittances to Kazakhstan, but for the most part, it's a net exporter of remittances.
Yeah, so specifically in the survey respondents, most people went to Russia, but people were still going to Kazakhstan and Turkey. Kazakhstan and Turkey were the next two. I think it's like 80% went to Russia. So.
So, other questions?
I just want to say thank you for addressing that question. I know it wasn't part of your study, but I was just curious. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I have some grants out to kind of look at the impact of COVID on this community. So we'll see. But
good luck with
very
it.
relevant. Thanks. Yeah.
So any last minute tips for his upcoming dissertation defense? Probably not.
Stay calm.
Stay calm, yes, right.
Open with a joke? Is that the... No.
I don't know.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you all. I really, really appreciate it. This has been very helpful for me. And I appreciate the chance to share this research. Yeah, thank you.
Well, welcome back to Mid-Michigan, and let's try to maintain this relationship if we can.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wish things were open up and I could see you all, but
yeah, well, it's new for us as well. Make do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.